Welcome to another Beehive video. Today I'm going to be looking at the differences between Affinity Photo and Photoshop with regard to the Marquee tool. There's a couple of ways that we can use the Marquee tool in both programs, and there's some cool little tricks that you can use both in Photoshop and Affinity Photo. I find in the end that they both complement each other in the feature set, and this is part of an ongoing series comparing the differences between Affinity Photo and Photoshop. So please check out the other videos. Okay, so to start off with, I've got two images open in both applications side by side. I have a grid line set up here in Affinity Photo. I'll go and create one now just briefly in Photoshop. So I'll just set one up at 50% in the middle there. So the Marquee tool is a tool that you find you will always use when editing. There are many ways to make selections, but being able to just draw a basic selection and do things like being able to crop to that selection is quite handy. We'll find the Marquee tool in Photoshop up here on the left. There are 4 different ways that we can draw a basic marquee, the shortcut key being M. Over in Affinity Photo, we have this icon here, looks very similar. We notice the 4 ways. There is another option here, freehand selection, but we'll leave that for another day because there is a similar tool called the lasso in Photoshop that achieves the same ends. So to make a selection, we'll start here since I'm already in Affinity Photo. To make a selection, we can press the M key for a shortcut or just select the rectangle. And it's as simple as holding down your left mouse and dragging. That will make a selection, and you can see the marching ants. Coming across to Photoshop, doing the same thing, pressing M on the keyboard or selecting the icon and clicking your left mouse. We'll do the same thing. I just had a setting on here. I'll just restore that and come back and explain that to you guys later. But if I just click left and drag, it will show us a nice little piece of information there. It shows us the actual pixel dimensions as we draw. I personally have never found that relevant, but it could be. If I let go, it does the same thing and shows us the marching ants. The marching ants in Affinity Photo look really cool, and definitely I prefer it over Photoshop. That's just a visual thing, but it's nice to see something a little bit more animated. Okay, so that's the basic of drawing a rectangular selection. Now, if I wanted to perhaps make that square proportional, so I want it to be an actual authentic square, I can do so in Photoshop by again left clicking and drag, but this time holding the shift key, and as I hold the shift key it will constrain those proportions. That's a nice little trick. Over in Affinity Photo, if I do the same here and click and drag and hold down the shift key, it also will constrain the proportions. So I'm letting go right now, you can see it's free. Holding down shift will constrain the selection. Now, if I wish to perhaps add to that selection, so I've got a bit over here, I've got a square here, and maybe I missed a bit of the selection over in this corner. I can do so by doing the following. Just before I do that, I'm going to make the screen a little bit bigger so you guys can see. Let's just zoom in like that. So I just press tab on my keyboard. I'm in both programs to remove the sidebars. So in Affinity Photo, if I wanted to add to a selection, if I actually, I'm just going to jump to Photoshop and show you Photoshop first because it's a real unique and kind of strange way you do it in Affinity Photo. But in Photoshop, it's a simple matter of holding down the shift key, and as you can see, the cursor changes to a plus icon. Holding down the shift key and dragging a selection, and where it intersects, it'll add that to the selection. So, okay, so we can add to an existing selection. In an Affinity Photo, you can do the same thing. You can add to a selection, but if you notice, if I press shift, it doesn't do anything. I'm pressing shift now. To add to a selection, we first start by drawing another marquee. So I'm going to hold down my left mouse and drag, and the marquee disappears, marching ants, and you're like, where the hell are they gone? They are there, trust me. hold down your right mouse. I'm still holding down my left. Then I hold down the right mouse button. So both at the same time. You can see it restores it and creates an intersect. Now, in order for it to be finalized, I let go first of the left mouse button and then the right, and it finishes it. I find that's really cumbersome. I guess with a bit of practice you would get used to it. But so if I draw another marquee, and now I'm going to add an additional one, click left, hold down my right mouse button, let go of the left mouse button, and let go of the right. Now if I just did it like this, one marquee and then left down to add another one, right click, and then if I let go of the right mouse button first, you can see it just goes and creates a single one. So you really need to do it in that specific order. So last time, left down, left up, right up. Oh my, that's a bit of work. And again in Photoshop, hold down Shift key, and just like that, you've got a selection. Much faster in Photoshop. Now to remove a selection, another shortcut key in Photoshop. By the way, these are shortcut keys. You can also achieve the same results by these icons at the top here. So you'll notice that we have up the top here, add to selection, remove from selection, and intersect. I find the shortcut keys much faster because you don't have to take your eye off the work. So holding down the Alt key will bring up a new cursor icon. You can see there it's got a minus, and if I click and drag with my left mouse, it cuts into the selection and removes a bit of your selection. Your marching ants will change. Really simple. In Affinity Photo, to remove a part of the selection, I also press the Alt key in this instance. But this little feature in Affinity Photo I find really cool. Certainly better than Photoshop in this instance. If I hold down the Alt key and click and drag on the left mouse button into the selection, you can see that the selection is dynamic, like it's showing me live what's happening. So if I let go, it's done the selection. But that kind of nice visual feedback is a great way. Back in Photoshop, if I hold down left and drag, it's not so fancy looking. Does the same, has the same result in the end, but it's just a nice little visual touch that makes it fun to work with. Okay, so sometimes you make a selection, then you just want to move that selection. I've done this plenty of times. So if I just remove that selection, start again, and just do maybe just a box. If I wanted to move this selection, if I just perhaps left click right now and move, there you go. Pretty simple, isn't it? So it's as simple as drawing your object and then clicking and dragging. There is another way in Photoshop, and that is to click, drag, and before you let go of your mouse, the left mouse button, hold down the space bar, and I'm able to move it. So left click and drag, holding down the space bar, still have my mouse pressed down, the left button, and I can drag it into position. But of course, you can just draw it and then left click and move it, whichever way works for you best. It is kind of handy though that you can just draw and quickly position it before you continue finishing the selection. That's kind of neat. In Affinity Photo, to move our selection, if I draw the object and press spacebar, see how it doesn't do anything like Photoshop, so it doesn't have that draw and move at the same time tool, but it does have the ability to move the selection nonetheless. So if I just draw the selection, I let go of the mouse button left, and then you see the cursor here changes to the move icon, I can then just move the selection into place. And of course, it's just a matter of if I wanted to modify that selection, just to hold down the left shift key and I can pull it in like this visually. In Photoshop, to achieve that same ends, I could have just begun the marquee, and then hold down my shift key, brought it across, and then made my adjustments. In the end, I don't think there's a great deal of difference in terms of time between the both, achieving the same ends, that is. Okay, Now, if I bring up the toolbar in Affinity Photo, we'll see that with the Marquee tool, we have the same tool set, if you like, as Photoshop rather. It's just that Photoshop displays the tool set as icons, whereas Affinity Photo literally spells it out. You'll notice with the Marquee tool selected in Affinity Photo that it has a couple of other options, as does Photoshop some options, but it has in particular anti-aliasing, in which Photoshop does not. Now, the difference in what anti-aliasing is that it adds basically some slight blur into the edges of your selection, so that the edges aren't exactly jagged. Now, I have found that the difference in Photoshop to Affinity Photo, it appears that Photoshop does a better job with anti-aliasing. I have experimented with Affinity Photo, and I'll just show it to you and you can see it for yourself. So with it off, with anti-aliasing off, I'll just do a little box here like that, and I'm going to copy that to a new layer, that selection. So I'm going to Control J to duplicate it, and we'll just type in the layer and give that a name none. We'll come along and check anti-aliasing on and do the same thing, another box, and also jump that to copy it. It didn't copy it because I need to make sure my background layer was selected, so Control J on that. I'll just throw that layer out. Okay, so here we have our anti-aliased version and the none version. So I'll turn off the background just so I can see these two together and bring them on top of each other. And just to zoom in into both, I did cover the zoom tool in the last video. So what you should be noticing now is nothing really. Why? Because there's nothing to correct in terms of the edges. We're looking at a straight edge here. Anti-aliasing only really is necessary when you have curves in particular. So you can't visually see a difference now. Even if I zoom into a ridiculous scale, you can see here I'm at 14,000, so I'm at a sub-pixel level. We're not going to see any differences between the two. And I am right in the middle. We're right in the middle of both, so we should be visually seeing a difference here. Anti-aliasing has its place, but as I said, with regard to curves, so I don't personally know why that is actually available with regard to a square marquee. If anyone has any ideas, let me know. Over in Photoshop, you'll notice if I select the marquee drop down, we get 4 other choices, and there's something similar in Affinity Photo I'll cover in a second. But if I select the square, which is currently selected, there is no anti-aliasing option. So perhaps that's why, because it's only useful for a round object or something with a curve. So if I select a curve, say an elliptical marquee tool, which is just a different shape, it's an elliptical, it can also be by holding down Shift, a circle. It does give me the anti-aliasing option, so I'll leave it unchecked and we'll do the same thing. I'll just draw a circle here, Control J to copy, and turning it on this time. Just before I do that, let's just give this a name as none. And I'll turn it on and draw it, another one, and jump that. So we have 2 circles. And now let's zoom into both. So with the one that's none, we can see jagged edges. With the one that does have anti-aliasing, also jagged edges. In my experimentation, I've found that the anti-aliasing tool just generally is dependent really on the actual object drawn. Like, so you can see here on both edges, I bring this across, it's clear that anti-aliasing is being applied. You can see like a softening of the edge being applied to the layer that had the anti-aliasing, whereas the other all the way around is jagged. As to why the anti-aliasing isn't being applied throughout the curve. So on the there should be anti-aliasing here. I honestly don't know. That's just an interesting find. Nonetheless, I'll carry on. So I put the guides up on the screen here because I want to show you something that's quite useful. This also applies to grids. Both programs have grids, which I'll cover in another video, but just with a guide, because I haven't shown guides are just literally that, just a guide that allows you to have a visual guide when doing page layouts or something like that. But you can also snap to guides. And with regard to the Marquee tool, we can do just that. So with the Marquee tool selected, if I bring my edge to the edge of the guide, see how it snaps there? So that's really useful, particularly if you're doing any kind of laying out, like a brochure or something like that. Again, over in Affinity Photo, doing the same thing and does just the same, snaps to that guide. Those guides are useful also because you can move them. You can just grab them with the move tool and just move them out. So you can come along at any time and snap to those. I just wanted to point that out. Let's remove those, and I can just grab and flick it away. Grab and flick it away. Okay. So back to the Marquee tool in Photoshop. Photoshop also provides some additional options. So with the basic square selected, we have these styles. Affinity Photo does not have this. And this allows us to have normal, which is default, which is the same as Affinity Photo, but it also has fixed ratio, where we can type in a ratio such as 1:1, which will obviously mean it's square all the time. So I'm not holding down Shift right now. We're going to also punch in, say, the ratio for a photo, 3:2, and then draw. And it's always going to be at that same ratio. So that's handy if you were to extend this into the cropping tool. That will be another video. But with the cropping tool, of course, we can just go and create a crop selection from our marquee. But again, I'll get into that another stage. So with the marquee fixed ratio, we can just do what it says, punch in an actual ratio, which is handy. We also have fixed size where we can type in the dimensions. So 64 by 64 will be little squares. As you can see there, hold down the Shift key, I can create lots of little selections. Pretty cool way to create a pattern if you're looking to do something like that. You do also have a random pattern generator in Photoshop, but this is a pretty quick way to do it also. We don't get those options or anything similar in Affinity Photo. But we do have an option to feather, and now let's look at that now. So feather in will feather the edge of a selection. So if I come along here, and I'll start by doing just a normal selection and just creating a copy of that, making sure the layer is selected. I'll just copy it, and then this time we can either type in a value of 7 pixels, say, or I can just hit the arrow and scrub along to grab a measurement we're after. Or I can just left click and drag left or right on the actual text itself. So with the feather in applied, if I do a selection now, and you can't visually see right now the selection, although sometimes depending on your actual feather in itself, you do get cornered edges because it's feathering also the edges, even of a square. So when I Control J to copy that, and we'll just turn off the background layer, you can see the visual difference. It's added the kind of softening and transparency to the edges. Over in Photoshop with the Marquee tool selected, we also have feather in. So just restoring this to normal and putting in something similar, but we can also scrub along there by selecting the name or just typing in a value. We don't get the same drop down option that we have in Affinity Photo, where we can just scrub along here, but it's just as quick in my opinion just to grab the text itself in both programs. So if I draw a selection with feather and zoom in, we can see there it's created some curved edges, kind of indicating already that it is feathering. I'll just turn that off and zero it out, create another one, and we'll see the difference without feathering, with feathering. So really useful feathering in many scenarios, particularly if you're trying to do composition work and you're trying to blend backgrounds together. Okay, with both programs you get additional selection tools. So I've already briefly mentioned the Marquee tool, the elliptical tool, where that allows us to create circular or elliptical shapes. That's really the extent of that. You will notice though that I'll just turn these off. In Affinity Photo, we have an option for anti-aliasing, which in this case is really appropriate because we do have curved edges. And in Photoshop, if I go the elliptical tool here, we also get anti-aliasing. Once again, useful when applied to a curve. There's two other options, and I'm going to leave freehand tool selection for another day because I want to show its equivalent in Photoshop. We have column and row. Now, column and row do just that. It allows us to do a selection based on a fixed width. So column meaning if I click and drag, it fills the entire vertical height, or top to bottom, based upon the width I've selected here in the toolbar. So if I just make that a bit bigger and just left click and drag slightly, I don't have to go very far, it will draw and apply the width with feathering if I wish, and interestingly with anti-aliasing. In Photoshop, if I come along here in Photoshop and go to the single column marquee tool, that is the equivalent, we don't get an option in this instance to actually draw the width or specify the width. If I just turn on my background layer and then hit click, you'll see that it's gone and created a very, very thin layer. In fact, this is actually just 1 pixel long. So if I go and hit Control J and turn off this layer, it's got a 1 pixel wide selection. But I don't get the option to actually specify the size or the width of the row or column. I can put a feather in there. Why would feather 1 pixel? Not too sure. Now, in Photoshop, you'll find that just because it's not on the toolbar doesn't mean it's the whole truth. So when I say that it creates a 1 pixel column marquee, well, that's not the whole story. You probably may have saw it. We have a properties panel open here on the right hand side, and on the right hand side we have a W indicating width. So in this instance here, where I'm going to draw another single column, I can come along and enter a value for the width, or just drag it across. And when I click to place the column, well, it doesn't add a width. You may be wondering why that is the case. Well, the properties panel is in relation to whatever it is we have selected with reference to our layer stack. So just as a quick side, if I add a hue saturation layer, the properties panel will adjust to show relevant properties for that particular, in this case, an adjustment layer. But when we have a pixel layer selected, just a rasterized layer, it's going to show us the physical properties of the layer. So in this case, we've got the width, the height, and the coordinates, the X and Y coordinates of that. So no, I wasn't fooling you. You really can't enter a width or a height for the columns. In any case, how often would you use that? In my opinion, it's just as easy to go rectangle. If you go outside of the screen, click and drag, there's your column, and you can use the information that is provided in the little tooltip there to give you your size you want anyway. It's much quicker. I think that is it. Just have a quick look here, and yes, that is all. So that covers the Marquee tool. The Marquee tool is something that, like I said, you use all the time. But there are other fantastic ways to make selections that can sometimes be much quicker. In any case, that will do it for today. Please like and subscribe. This is the third video of an ongoing series comparing the differences between Affinity Photo and Photoshop. In this instance, I think it's a draw. They both have their feature sets. I'll see you soon. Thanks so much.